August 19, 1942, dense jungle near Tivu Point, Guadalcanal. Second Lieutenant Genjiro Imi of the 8th Independent Anti-Tank Gun Company recorded observations in his diary that captured the shock many Japanese soldiers felt upon encountering American forces. Through the thick canopy of palm trees and strangling vines, Imi and 916 other soldiers of Colonel Kona Ichiki's detachment had just landed from destroyers, completing a nighttime insertion that Japanese command believed would be the first step toward recapturing Henderson Field. They had been told the Americans numbered perhaps 2,000 men, poorly trained, easily frightened, soft from lives of luxury. Colonel Ichiki himself had dismissed warnings to wait for reinforcements. "These are Americans," he told his officers. "We will sweep them into the sea before sunrise." What none of these battle-hardened veterans of China and Southeast Asia knew was that they were about to encounter something unprecedented in the annals of the Imperial Japanese Army. Not merely defeat, which was itself unthinkable for soldiers who had known nothing but victory since 1937, but a systematic demolition of every tactical assumption, every strategic concept, every ideological certainty that defined the Japanese way of war. The jungle itself would become an American weapon. The darkness that Japanese forces had owned since the beginning of the war would betray them, and the overwhelming superiority in equipment, coordination, and sheer destructive capability would shatter the myth of Japanese invincibility in close combat. The transformation had begun 2 weeks earlier on August 7th, when 11,000 United States Marines of the 1st Marine Division stormed ashore at Lunga Point. General Alexander Vandergrift's Leathernecks were executing Operation Watchtower, the first American offensive operation of the Pacific War. Their objective seemed straightforward on paper: seize the nearly completed Japanese airfield, establish a defensive perimeter, hold the position until relieved. In reality, they were about to fight the longest, most brutal campaign in Marine Corps history, up to that point in an environment that would test human endurance to its absolute limits. The island itself was a vision of tropical hell. Guadalcanal stretched 90 mi long and 25 mi wide, its interior dominated by mountains reaching 8,000 ft into perpetual clouds. The coastal plain where Henderson Field sat was a strip of kunai grass, swamp and jungle, so thick that visibility dropped to mere feet. The heat was suffocating, humidity never dropping below 90%. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds so dense that men inhaled them. The rivers and streams that looked clear and inviting on reconnaissance photographs teemed with parasites and disease. Malaria, dengue fever, dysentery and tropical ulcers would eventually disable more men than enemy action. But on that first morning, the Marines found the airfield almost undefended. The 2,200 Japanese construction workers and 600 naval troops fled into the jungle, abandoning equipment, supplies, and most critically, the airfield itself. By nightfall on August 8th, American engineers were already working to complete the runway. They would name it Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at Midway. Within days, the first aircraft would land, and the island would become home to what history would remember as the Cactus Air Force. The Japanese response was swift and catastrophic for American naval forces. On the night of August 9th, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa led 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer through the darkness in a brilliant surprise attack. The Battle of Savo Island became the worst defeat in United States Navy history. 4 heavy cruisers, USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, USS Astoria, and HMS Canberra, were sent to the bottom in less than an hour. More than 1,000 sailors died in the flaming waters. The surviving Allied naval forces withdrew, taking with them most of the supplies that had not yet been unloaded. The Marines were stranded, cut off, facing a reinforced enemy with barely half their equipment and food. What the Japanese High Command failed to grasp in those early August days was that Henderson Field had become the key to everything. Control of the airfield meant control of the surrounding seas during daylight hours. Aircraft operating from Henderson could strike any Japanese ship within 200 miles. This single fact would dictate the entire nature of the campaign. The Japanese could own the night, sending in troops and supplies aboard fast destroyers in runs that became known as the Tokyo Express. But when dawn broke, American aircraft ruled the skies. The strategic situation demanded that Japan retake Henderson Field immediately before the Americans could fortify their position. Imperial General Headquarters assigned the task to Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake's 17th Army, based at Rabaul. Hyakutake had only limited forces available. The 35th Infantry Brigade, under Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, was at Palau. The 4th Infantry Regiment was in the Philippines. The closest unit was Colonel Ichiki's 28th Infantry Regiment, which had been stationed near Guam, originally intended for the Midway operation that had been cancelled after the naval disaster in June. Colonel Kona Ichiki was an infantry school instructor with a reputation as a first-rate tactician. He was also known for being impulsive and having supreme confidence in Japanese fighting spirit over American material. Before departing Truk for Guadalcanal, Ichiki received clear orders to wait for the rest of his regiment before attempting to retake the airfield. But Ichiki had very little respect for American soldiers. He had studied reports from China, from the Philippines, from everywhere Japanese forces had encountered Western troops. They lacked discipline. They broke under pressure. They could not match Japanese warriors in close combat. On the night of August 18th, 6 destroyers delivered 917 men of Ichiki's first echelon to Taivu Point, 15 miles east of the American perimeter. The landing went smoothly, undetected by American forces. Ichiki immediately sent out reconnaissance patrols to assess enemy strength and defensive positions. It was a routine tactical decision that would prove fatal. On August 19th, a patrol from Company A, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, under Captain Charles Brush, was moving along the coastal track toward Coley Point when they spotted Japanese soldiers. The two forces collided in a brief, vicious firefight. The Marines killed 31 Japanese soldiers and captured documents that revealed the presence of a significant enemy force in the area. More importantly, the captured papers showed that the Japanese severely underestimated American strength. Captain Brush raced back to the perimeter with his intelligence haul. General Vandergrift immediately understood what was coming, a Japanese attack soon, probably from the east. He ordered Colonel Clifton Cates to strengthen defenses along the sandbar at the mouth of what Marines called the Tenaru River. It was actually the Ilu River, but the misidentification would stick in all subsequent accounts. Cates deployed Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Cresswell's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, along the riverbank with machine guns positioned to create interlocking fields of fire across the sandbar. What happened next would become one of the most one-sided battles in Marine Corps history. Colonel Ichiki, rather than waiting for intelligence from his lost patrol or for reinforcements, decided to attack immediately. On the night of August 20th, into the early morning of August 21st, he ordered a frontal assault directly across the sandbar. Japanese doctrine emphasized the superiority of spiritual power and aggressive night attacks to overcome enemy firepower. Ichiki believed his veterans could break through American defenses through sheer audacity and close-quarters fighting, where Japanese soldiers excelled with bayonets and grenades. Just after midnight, Solomon Island scout Jacob Vuza, who had escaped Japanese captivity after hours of torture, stumbled into Marine lines with a warning. The Japanese were coming. Minutes later, the attack began. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers charged across the sandbar, screaming battle cries, firing rifles, hurling grenades. They ran directly into a killing zone the Marines had prepared with methodical precision. The M1997A1 Browning water-cooled machine guns opened fire. These weapons, perfected during World War I, were the unsung heroes of Marine firepower. Each gun could sustain 600 rounds per minute indefinitely, as long as the water jackets stayed filled. The Marines had positioned them in mutually supporting positions so that no area of the sandbar remained uncovered. Japanese soldiers fell in waves as the heavy .30 caliber rounds tore through flesh and bone. Those who made it across the sandbar encountered 37mm anti-tank guns loaded with canister rounds, essentially giant shotgun shells that turned men into shredded meat. The attack continued for hours. Wave after wave of Japanese soldiers charged into the machine gun fire. Some made it to the Marine positions and engaged in hand-to-hand combat. Marines fought with rifles, knives, fists, anything available. But the defensive preparations held. The interlocking fields of fire prevented any Japanese breakthrough. As dawn approached, Colonel Ichiki's attack had completely stalled. More than 800 of his men lay dead or dying on the sandbar and in the shallow water. Daybreak brought no relief for the surviving Japanese. General Vandergrift ordered a counterattack using elements of the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines. 5. M3. Stuart light tanks crossed the sandbar and began systematically hunting down Japanese soldiers who had taken cover in the coconut groves. War correspondent Richard Tregaskis, watching from a Marine position, described the scene. It was fascinating to see them bustling amongst the trees, pivoting, turning, spitting sheets of yellow flame. We had not realized there were so many Japanese in the grove. Group after group were flushed out and shot down by the tank's canister shells. By midday on August 21st, the Battle of the Tenaru was over. Of the 917 Japanese soldiers who had landed at Taivu Point, approximately 800 were dead. Approximately 128 survivors, mostly from support units that had remained near the landing site, melted into the jungle. They would send a radio message to the 17th Army headquarters reporting the disaster. Among the dead was Colonel Ichiki himself, though accounts differ on how he died. The official Japanese version claimed he burned his regimental colors and committed ritual suicide. Some witnesses insisted he died, leading to a final charge. Marine casualties were approximately 40, killed and wounded. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese soldiers was devastating. Captured documents and post-war accounts revealed the shock of learning that an entire regiment had been annihilated in a single night. The Americans had not fought the way Japanese doctrine predicted. They did not panic under night attack. They did not break when charged by screaming warriors. Instead, they had waited in prepared positions, allowed the Japanese to enter killing zones, and systematically destroyed them with concentrated firepower. The most devastating revelation came from examining captured equipment and assessing the battlefield. The Americans possessed a level of material wealth the Japanese intelligence had completely failed to comprehend. The Browning machine guns never jammed, never overheated beyond their designed capacity, never failed from poor maintenance or inadequate spare parts. Every Marine seemed to carry more ammunition than an entire Japanese squad. The artillery support that Marines could call upon exceeded anything the Japanese could deploy, and the coordination between infantry, artillery, and even naval gunfire from ships offshore represented an integrated system of destruction that Japanese forces had never encountered. Within days of the Tenaru disaster, more Japanese forces were already en route to Guadalcanal. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto organized a massive naval operation to support the next attempt to retake Henderson Field. 3 slow transport ships departed Truk on August 16th, carrying the remaining 1,400 soldiers from Ichiki's regiment, plus 500 naval marines. After the naval battle of the Eastern Solomons resulted in heavy damage to one of the transports, Japanese command decided to abandon slow transport ships entirely. Instead, they would use destroyers for what became known as the Tokyo Express runs. Between August 29th and September 4th, various destroyers and light cruisers delivered almost 5,000 troops of Major General Kawaguchi's 35th Infantry Brigade to Taivu Point. The Tokyo Express worked brilliantly as a method of moving men. Destroyers could make the round trip from the Shortland Islands to Guadalcanal in a single night, minimizing exposure to American air attack. But the method had a critical weakness. Heavy equipment could not be transported this way. Artillery pieces, tanks, trucks, and most importantly, adequate food and ammunition had to be left behind. This logistical reality would ultimately doom every Japanese offensive on Guadalcanal. Soldiers arrived with only what they could carry. They depended on local foraging and whatever supplies could be infiltrated through American lines. As the campaign wore on, Japanese troops would find themselves fighting not just against American firepower, but against starvation itself. General Kawaguchi set September 12th as the date for his assault on Henderson Field. His plan called for a three-pronged attack. One force would strike from the west along the coastal area. A second force would attack from the south, penetrating through dense jungle to strike at what Japanese intelligence believed was the weakest point in American defenses. Kawaguchi himself would lead the main effort from the south, approaching along an inland ridge that dominated Henderson Field. What Kawaguchi did not know was that Marine intelligence had already identified this ridge as the most likely avenue of approach. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, commanding officer of the 1st Raider Battalion, conducted a raid on Tasimboko village on September 8th and discovered massive supply dumps, indicating a large Japanese force was concentrating in the area. Edson immediately understood the Japanese plan. They would come from the south, using the ridge as their approach route. Edson requested permission to establish a defensive line on the ridge itself. General Vandergrift approved. On September 10th and 11th, Edson positioned approximately 840 Marines from his raiders and the 1st Parachute Battalion along the ridge. He selected defensive positions with the same methodical care that had characterized the Tenaru defenses. Machine guns positioned to create interlocking fire, mortar crews registered on likely approach routes. Artillery from the 11th Marines plotted defensive fire missions. Every advantage of terrain and firepower was calculated and prepared. The ridge itself was a narrow coral spine, approximately 1,000 meter long, consisting of 3 distinct hills covered with kunai grass and scattered trees. Deep ravines bordered both sides, heavily wooded and in some places impenetrable. It was the perfect terrain for a night attack by infiltrating infantry. It was also, if properly defended, a killing ground. On the night of September 12th, Kawaguchi's forces began their assault. Unlike Ichiki's frontal charge, this was a more sophisticated attack. Japanese infantry infiltrated through the ravines on both sides of the ridge, attempting to envelop American positions. Small units probed for weak points. When they found them, larger forces concentrated for breakthrough attempts. The fighting was savage and confused. In the darkness, Marines sometimes found themselves engaged in hand-to-hand combat with Japanese soldiers who had infiltrated to within grenade range. But the defensive preparations held. When Japanese forces concentrated for breakthrough attempts, Marine mortars and artillery shattered them. The 11th Marines fired more than 2,000 rounds during the night, dropping high explosive shells so close to Marine positions that shrapnel wounded friendly troops. Machine gun crews fired until their barrels glowed red in the darkness. Individual Marines fought with rifles, pistols, knives, entrenching tools, anything that came to hand. Sergeant Major Jacob Vuza, the same scout who had warned of the Tenaru attack, moved through the lines, encouraging Marines and pointing out Japanese infiltration routes. Sergeant John Basilone manned a machine gun position that became critical to the defense. When his gun crews were killed or wounded, Basilone continued firing alone, repelling wave after wave of Japanese attacks. He would later receive the Medal of Honor for his actions that night. 2 Marines would earn the Medal of Honor at Edson's Ridge, and 19 would receive the Navy Cross. As dawn broke on September 13th, the Japanese attack had failed to break through, but Kawaguchi had more troops available and prepared to renew the assault the following night. Edson pulled his lines back to the center of the ridge, consolidating his forces. General Vandergrift sent reinforcements, bringing the total defending force to approximately 2,500 men. The Japanese would attack again, but this time the Marines were ready with even stronger positions and more concentrated firepower. The second night's fighting was even more intense than the first. Kawaguchi threw his remaining forces into desperate attempts to break through before American reinforcements made the position impregnable. Japanese soldiers charged repeatedly, dying by the hundreds in the machine gun fire. Some attacks came within 50 yards of Edson's command post before being stopped. At one point, the situation was so desperate that Edson himself grabbed a rifle and joined the firing line. But again, American firepower and defensive preparation prevailed. By dawn on September 14th, Kawaguchi's offensive had completely collapsed. Japanese casualties were staggering. Approximately 830 to 850 Japanese soldiers died on and around Edson's Ridge. Marine casualties totaled approximately 104 killed and over 200 wounded between the Raider and parachute battalions. The ridge that would forever after be known as Bloody Ridge or Edson's Ridge had become a monument to the effectiveness of American defensive doctrine. For Japanese soldiers who survived, the battle represented another profound shock to their understanding of warfare. Captured diaries and post-war accounts consistently described the same realization. Japanese forces had expected to fight other infantry in darkness where their training and spirit would triumph. Instead, they encountered artillery, machine guns, and mortars, all concentrated with a precision they could not match. American commanders knew the Japanese were coming. They prepared killing zones. They waited for Japanese forces to enter. Then they destroyed them with coordinated fire support. The battles at Tenaru and Bloody Ridge established patterns that would repeat throughout the Guadalcanal campaign. Japanese forces would launch attacks based on courage, night tactics, and close combat expertise. American forces would respond with overwhelming firepower, coordinated combined arms operations, and defensive positions carefully prepared to maximize their advantages. The outcome was predictable. Japanese casualties would be catastrophic. American casualties would be significant but sustainable, but numbers alone do not capture the horror of jungle warfare on Guadalcanal. The environment itself became a weapon that killed with impartiality. Malaria infected nearly every man who spent more than a few weeks on the island. By December 1942, the 1st Marine Division would report over 8,000 malaria cases. Tropical diseases disabled approximately 2 to 3 of the division. Dysentery was universal. Men suffered from fungal infections that ate through skin. Jungle rot caused open sores that never healed in the humid heat. Dental problems with no treatment led to abscessed teeth and systemic infections. The Japanese suffered even worse. Their supply situation meant inadequate food from the beginning. Soldiers were supposed to receive field rations, but the Tokyo Express could rarely deliver enough. Men subsisted on whatever they could forage, supplemented by occasional rice deliveries that had to be stretched impossibly thin. Starvation became a constant companion. Medical supplies were almost non-existent. Quinine for malaria prevention ran out quickly and was never adequately resupplied. Wounded soldiers often died from infections that would have been easily treatable with proper medicine. Japanese documents captured later in the campaign painted a horrifying picture of conditions. A medical officer's report from late October noted that more than 60% of the 17th Army's forces on Guadalcanal were incapacitated by disease or malnutrition. Combat effectiveness had dropped to perhaps 30% of authorized strength. Soldiers were dying at a rate of 50 per day, most from starvation and disease rather than combat wounds. American supply ships protected by Henderson Field aircraft during daylight hours regularly delivered food, ammunition, medical supplies, and replacement equipment. Shortages occurred, particularly in August and early September, when naval defeats left the Marines temporarily cut off. But these were temporary. By October, the flow of supplies had become reliable. Marines ate canned rations that, while not appetizing, provided adequate calories and nutrition. Ammunition was plentiful enough that machine gunners could fire until their barrels wore out, then request replacements. Medical care included field hospitals with surgical capabilities, plasma for blood transfusions, sulfur drugs for infection, and eventual evacuation of serious cases to rear area hospitals. Japanese logistics consisted of whatever could be carried on destroyer decks or infiltrated through American lines. Soldiers learned to make a single rice ball last an entire day. Ammunition was conserved to the point that orders often restricted fire to only when absolutely necessary. Medical care meant a bandage if you were lucky, amputation without anesthesia if you were unlucky, or death if your wound became infected. Seriously wounded soldiers were often given grenades and left behind to commit suicide rather than burden their units or risk capture. In late October, the Japanese mounted their largest offensive of the campaign. General Hyakutake himself came to Guadalcanal to personally command the operation. He brought elements of the 2nd Division, including experienced troops from China. The plan called for coordinated attacks from multiple directions, with the main effort coming from the south through dense jungle similar to the Bloody Ridge approach. This time, however, Japanese forces would have more men, better coordination, and artillery support that had finally been delivered via destroyers. The offensive began on October 23rd with a preliminary attack from the west. 9 Japanese tanks, rare on Guadalcanal because of the difficulty transporting them, led an assault across the Matanikau River. American defenders, including elements of the newly arrived 164th Infantry Regiment from the American Division, were ready. Anti-tank guns, artillery, and even an M3 Stuart tank knocked out all 9 Japanese tanks in quick succession. The attack collapsed with heavy casualties. The main assault came on the night of October 24th to 25th. Approximately 5,600 Japanese troops under Major General Yumio Nasu attacked from the south, hoping to break through American lines south of Henderson Field. They faced the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines under Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, reinforced by elements of the 164th Infantry Regiment. The fighting that night became legendary in Marine Corps history. Japanese attacks came in waves throughout the night. Individual breakthroughs were sealed by immediate counterattacks. Machine gunners fired until their weapons failed, then grabbed rifles and continued fighting. Artillery from the 11th Marines fired danger-close missions that landed within yards of Marine positions. Offshore, the battleship USS Washington stood by, ready to provide naval gunfire support if called upon. At one critical moment, only a single Marine battalion stood between Japanese forces and Henderson Field, but they did not break. Sergeant John Basilone, who had distinguished himself at Bloody Ridge, again became critical to the defense. When ammunition ran low for his machine gun section, Basilone personally carried ammunition through enemy fire to keep his guns operational. He repaired damaged machine guns under fire. When one gun position was overrun, he grabbed a .45 pistol and led a counterattack that restored the line. By dawn, on October 25th, the Japanese offensive had failed. General Nasu was dead, killed by machine gun fire during one of the night attacks. More than 2,000 Japanese soldiers died in the attempt to break through. American casualties were several hundred, killed and wounded, severe but sustainable. October 1942 also saw major naval engagements that decisively shifted the balance of power around Guadalcanal. The naval Battle of Guadalcanal, fought over 4 days from November 12th through 15th, saw some of the most intense surface combat in naval history. In a confused nighttime melee on November 13th, American cruisers and destroyers engaged a Japanese bombardment force that included the battleships Hiei and Kirishima. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan and Rear Admiral Norman Scott, the only 2 American flag officers killed in World War II surface engagements, died in the fighting. The Americans lost 2 light cruisers and 4 destroyers. 3 more destroyers were damaged, but the Japanese lost the battleship Hiei disabled in the night action and sunk by aircraft the following day. More importantly, the bombardment mission failed. Henderson Field remained operational. On the night of November 14th to 15th, the battleship Kirishima attempted another bombardment, but was intercepted by the USS Washington and USS South Dakota. In a devastating display of American radar-directed gunnery, Washington put 9 16-inch shells into Kirishima at ranges where Japanese lookouts could barely see their target. Kirishima sank with heavy loss of life. Perhaps most significantly, American aircraft and surface ships destroyed a Japanese convoy attempting to land the 38th Division with heavy equipment. Of 11 transport ships, only 4 reached Guadalcanal, and these were destroyed by aircraft and artillery before they could fully unload. Japanese casualties from the convoy exceeded 5,000 men. This was the last serious attempt to reinforce Guadalcanal with a large, properly equipped ground force. For Japanese troops already on the island, November marked the beginning of the end. They had expected reinforcement and resupply. Instead, they learned that the naval battles had failed, that the convoys were destroyed, that no more help was coming. Rations were reduced again. Already starving men were told to survive on even less. Medical supplies that had been critically short became non-existent. The sick and wounded filled makeshift field hospitals where doctors could do nothing except watch men die. Captured Japanese diaries from this period painted a picture of slow collapse. Entries described rice rations reduced to 1 ball per day, disease spreading everywhere, bodies burned when soldiers had the strength, the realization that no more supplies were coming, men eating grass and bark, deaths from poisonous plants, the deterioration of soldiers into desperate, starving shadows. December brought the final reckoning. The Japanese command at Rabaul made the decision to evacuate Guadalcanal. They could not admit defeat publicly, but privately they recognized that continuing the operation meant the complete destruction of the 17th Army. It was a remarkable achievement under difficult circumstances, but it could not disguise the magnitude of the defeat. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal reached a peak strength of approximately 36,000 personnel. Of these, roughly 25,000 to 30,000 died. About 14,800 killed in combat and 10,000 to 15,000 from disease and starvation. American casualties were also severe but sustainable. The Marines and Army units that fought on Guadalcanal lost approximately 1,600 killed in action, 4,200 wounded, and several thousand more temporarily disabled by tropical diseases. But American industry and manpower could replace these losses. New divisions were already training. Ships and aircraft were being produced faster than they could be lost. The strategic initiative had permanently shifted. The psychological impact of Guadalcanal on Japanese military thought cannot be overstated. For the first time, Japanese forces had been defeated in sustained ground combat. Every offensive had failed. Every attempt to apply traditional Japanese tactical doctrine had resulted in catastrophic casualties. The revelation that American forces were not only materially superior, but also tactically competent, well led, and capable of enduring terrible conditions shattered pre-war assumptions. Japanese officers who survived Guadalcanal and later wrote memoirs or were interviewed after the war consistently emphasized several themes. First, they had completely underestimated American fighting qualities. Second, the disparity in equipment and supplies was far greater than intelligence had suggested. Third, Japanese logistics were fundamentally inadequate for sustained operations against an enemy that controlled the sea and air. Fourth, spiritual power and tactical skill were insufficient against systematic disadvantages in firepower and resources. Post-war accounts from Japanese veterans revealed a consistent assessment. They had believed they were superior warriors. They trained harder, accepted death more readily, mastered night fighting and close combat. But on Guadalcanal, they learned that war is decided by systems. The Americans had systems for everything, systems for supply, for medical care, for artillery support, for air coordination. Every system functioned. Japanese systems failed because they were never built properly in the first place. Japanese veterans who survived the campaign and were later interviewed provided detailed accounts that contradicted official Japanese explanations for defeat. They acknowledged that American forces fought superbly at night when defending prepared positions. They admitted Americans endured malaria, dysentery, and terrible conditions while maintaining combat effectiveness because logistics supported them. They recognized that American firepower was overwhelming, coordinated, and precisely delivered. A single American battalion had more effective firepower than an entire Japanese regiment. The technical aspects of American superiority were significant. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal fought with Arisaka rifles, bolt-action weapons requiring manual cycling between shots. American Marines initially carried M1903 Springfield rifles, also bolt-action, but supplemented by the M1 Garand semi-automatic rifle as these became available. The Garand's 8-round capacity and semi-automatic operation provided advantages in firefights. Machine guns told an even starker story. The American M19-7A1 Browning was water-cooled and could sustain fire indefinitely as long as water and ammunition were available. Japanese machine guns, primarily the Type 96 and Type 99, were lighter and more portable, but lacked sustained fire capability. In defensive positions, this difference was decisive. Artillery superiority was perhaps most significant. The 11th Marines operated M1A1 pack howitzers that could be broken down and transported through jungle terrain. These 75mm weapons provided responsive, accurate fire support. Forward observers with infantry units could call for fire missions and receive rounds within minutes. Japanese artillery on Guadalcanal was limited, difficult to move through the jungle and chronically short of ammunition. Naval gunfire added another dimension that Japanese forces could not match. Destroyers and cruisers offshore could deliver bombardments on Japanese positions or provide responsive fire support for Marine ground units. Radio communication between shore-based observers and naval ships allowed precise targeting. Air power became increasingly dominant as the campaign progressed. The Cactus Air Force, operating from Henderson Field under terrible conditions, gradually established air superiority over Guadalcanal. Marine and Army Air Force pilots flying F-4F Wildcats, P-39 Airacobras and P-40 Warhawks intercepted Japanese bomber raids. SBD Dauntless dive bombers struck Japanese positions, supply ships, and troop concentrations. Japanese air forces from Rabaul had to fly at the extreme limits of their range, giving them minimal time over target. The final American ground offensive in January 1943 demonstrated how completely the balance had shifted. Major General Alexander Patch's 14th Corps, now including both Marine and Army divisions, launched coordinated attacks that systematically reduced the remaining Japanese positions. The offensive had overwhelming support from artillery, air power, and naval gunfire. Japanese resistance, while determined, was hampered by starvation, disease, and ammunition shortages. On February 9, 1943, American patrols discovered that Japanese forces had evacuated. General Patch sent his famous message to Admiral Halsey: "Tokyo Express no longer has a terminus on Guadalcanal." The campaign was over. 6 months of fighting had resulted in the first major American ground victory against Japan. More importantly, it established patterns and revealed truths that would shape the rest of the Pacific War. The lessons Japanese survivors took from Guadalcanal were devastating to pre-war military doctrine. The myth of Japanese warrior superiority had been shattered. Individual courage and tactical skill were inadequate against systematic disadvantages. Night attacks and close combat, the hallmarks of Japanese tactical success in China, failed against American defensive positions. Supply and logistics were not secondary concerns, but fundamental requirements for sustained combat. Air and naval superiority determined outcomes on land. These lessons learned in blood and starvation on Guadalcanal should have fundamentally reformed Japanese military thinking. Some officers recognized the implications. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, a staff officer who visited Guadalcanal during the campaign, wrote afterward that Japan needed to completely reassess its strategy. The Americans, he observed, were fighting an industrial war where material production determined outcomes. Japan could not win an industrial war against American productive capacity. But Japanese military culture, built on generations of tradition and recent victories, could not easily accept such fundamental revision. The official explanation for Guadalcanal blamed inadequate supplies, naval defeats, and the unexpected strength of American defenses. It did not acknowledge that Japanese tactical doctrine itself was flawed, that the entire conception of warfare that had served Japan well against China was obsolete against a modern industrial opponent. Those Japanese soldiers who survived Guadalcanal and were later captured, or who survived the war, became witnesses to a transformation they never expected. They had entered the campaign as confident warriors of an invincible empire. They left as starving, disease-ridden survivors of a catastrophic defeat. Many later described Guadalcanal as the moment they first understood that Japan would lose the war. Post-war testimonies from Japanese veterans captured this psychological transformation. They acknowledged learning truths that leaders had hidden. The Americans were not weak, but overwhelmingly strong, not just in weapons, but in organization, logistics, leadership, and the ability to sustain combat operations. Japanese forces fought with courage and skill. It did not matter. American forces fought with systems and resources. Japanese forces could not match. The American perspective on Guadalcanal emphasized different lessons. For Marines and soldiers who fought there, the campaign proved that American forces could match Japanese troops in the brutality of jungle combat. The mythology of Japanese invincibility was destroyed. American defensive doctrine worked. Combined arms coordination was effective. Individual American soldiers, properly trained and equipped, were more than capable of defeating Japanese forces. But Americans also learned respect for Japanese soldiers as tough, determined, skilled adversaries who would fight to the death rather than surrender. The willingness of Japanese forces to continue attacking in the face of hopeless odds, to endure starvation rather than give up, to die rather than retreat, made a profound impression. The contrast between the two sides' approaches to prisoner welfare and surrender illustrated fundamental cultural differences. American forces made efforts to encourage Japanese surrender, dropping leaflets, broadcasting radio messages, offering medical care and food to prisoners. These efforts had minimal success. Of approximately 36,000 Japanese troops who served on Guadalcanal, fewer than 1,000 were captured alive, and most of those were too sick or wounded to resist. The strategic implications of Guadalcanal extended far beyond the island itself. Japan's failure to retake Henderson Field and the eventual evacuation demonstrated that the Japanese defensive perimeter could be penetrated. Allied strategy shifted from defensive operations to offensive campaigns. The industrial and material advantages that America possessed could be translated into military victory if applied systematically. For Japan, Guadalcanal marked the beginning of the end. The loss of experienced troops, pilots, and ships could not be replaced at anything approaching the rate America was producing new forces. The decision to evacuate admitted, however quietly, that Japan could not sustain attritional warfare against American industrial might. The veterans of Guadalcanal on both sides carried their experiences for the rest of their lives. American Marines and soldiers who survived the campaign became cadres for new units, passing along hard-won lessons about jungle warfare, defensive tactics, and combined arms coordination. The 1st Marine Division pulled off Guadalcanal in December 1942, required months of rest and rehabilitation before returning to combat. Japanese survivors faced an even grimmer future. Those evacuated during Operation K were dispersed to other units throughout the Pacific, carrying with them the psychological burden of defeat and the knowledge that American forces were far more formidable than pre-war propaganda had suggested. Many would die in subsequent battles as Japan's strategic position continued to deteriorate. The island of Guadalcanal itself bore the scars of 6 months of intense combat for decades afterward. Wrecked aircraft, destroyed vehicles, abandoned equipment, and unexploded ordnance littered the jungles and coastal areas. Henderson Field, expanded and improved during and after the campaign, served as a major Allied base for subsequent operations in the Solomons. For military historians and strategists, Guadalcanal provided case studies in amphibious operations, jungle warfare, logistics, air-ground coordination, and the integration of naval power with land operations. The campaign demonstrated that modern warfare required more than brave soldiers and tactical skill. It required industrial capacity, effective logistics, technological superiority, and the ability to sustain operations over extended periods. The human cost of Guadalcanal was staggering on both sides. More than 7,000 American and Japanese servicemen died in the naval battles around the island. On land, American casualties exceeded 7,000 killed, wounded, or missing. Japanese losses exceeded 30,000 from all causes. Thousands more on both sides suffered from diseases and conditions that would affect their health for the rest of their lives. But the strategic significance justified in military terms the terrible cost. Guadalcanal represented the turning point where Allied forces shifted from defense to offense in the Pacific. It demonstrated that Japan could be defeated in ground combat. It established air and naval superiority patterns that would characterize the rest of the war. The story of Japanese troops encountering American jungle warfare on Guadalcanal is ultimately a story about the collision between two fundamentally different approaches to modern warfare. One side believed in the supremacy of the warrior spirit, in courage overcoming material disadvantages, in tactics producing victory regardless of resources. The other side believed in systematic application of industrial power, in logistics and firepower as force multipliers, in combined arms coordination as the key to success. The jungle of Guadalcanal became the crucible where these conflicting philosophies met. The outcome, though it took 6 months of brutal fighting to reach its inevitable conclusion, demonstrated that concentrated fire support and logistics, when combined with competent tactics and determined soldiers, created a form of military power that Japanese forces simply could not match. For the Japanese soldiers who survived Guadalcanal and lived to tell their stories, the campaign represented the moment when reality destroyed illusion. They learned that their training had been based on false assumptions, Their tactics had been designed for a different kind of war. Their logistics had been inadequate from the beginning, and their nation was engaged in a conflict it could not win through military means alone. The Americans who fought on Guadalcanal learned different but equally important lessons. They discovered that they could match Japanese soldiers in the brutality of combat. They proved that American industrial power could be translated into military victory. They developed tactics and doctrine for jungle warfare that would serve them well in subsequent campaigns. And they shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility, replacing it with a realistic assessment of a tough, determined, but ultimately defeatable enemy. Guadalcanal was where Japanese troops were terrified not by American soldiers as individual fighters, though they proved formidable, but by the systematic, overwhelming, relentless application of firepower and material resources that American forces brought to every engagement. It was a terror born not from fear of death, which Japanese soldiers had been trained to accept, but from the realization that courage and sacrifice were meaningless against an enemy whose supplies never ran out, whose wounded received care, whose artillery never stopped firing, whose aircraft controlled the skies, and whose industrial base could replace losses faster than combat could inflict them. The transformation that began when Japanese forces first encountered American jungle warfare on Guadalcanal marked a fundamental shift in the Pacific War. From that point forward, Japanese forces would be on the defensive, fighting a losing battle against an enemy whose material advantages grew larger with each passing month. The jungle warfare of Guadalcanal became the template for future campaigns, proving that American forces could fight and win in the most difficult terrain against a determined enemy, provided they had adequate logistics, effective coordination, and overwhelming firepower.